Okay, we're halfway through the conference. Yeah, no. And I'd like to welcome you to our last session for today, which, as you can see, is called Capitalism Kills, the Case for Ecosocialism. So I think it's the appropriate topic for halfway through today. My name's Sue Bull, and I'm going to be your chairperson for this afternoon. And we've got that sort of topic that's really fascinating because it's the one that I often take introduction to Marxism classes, and it's the one question that everybody who's interested in socialism can answer. But can they think it through and can they see all of the elements of it? We're hoping that our speakers tonight, we're sure they will be able to, will actually give you all the ins and outs of why capitalism is shithouse for the environment. So, first of all, can I acknowledge that this conference is on the land of the Wadawurrung Noongar people? The land was never ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. The Socialist Alliance stands in solidarity with Indigenous people in the ongoing fight for freedom from incarceration, land rights and genuine material sovereignty. Okay, so this afternoon we've got two speakers. Originally we had three, but Tabitha Spence from the United States was going to come along with Amma Ali Jan, and so unfortunately that's not going to happen. And she's still in the US and it's really bad in terms of the time and so we're not going to be able to hear her, maybe next year. But we still have two wonderful speakers. Online we have Jess Spear from Ireland. Jess is an eco-socialist activist and local organiser for People Before Profit based in Dublin, Ireland. She's co-founder of the revolutionary Marxist group RISE and was chief editor of Rupture magazine. And sitting on my left, we have Susan Price, who's probably not an unknown quantity to most of you. She is the co-editor of Green Left, a member of Socialist Alliance's national executive. And a lot of the work that Susan does is actually looking at international issues and, of course, the discussion that we're going to have today. So, without further ado, we're going to go straight to Jess. So, welcome, Jess.
Hi there. I want to first thank the organisers of Ecosocialism for the invitation to speak today. I'm really honoured to be here online and to contribute what I can to the discussion on the case for ecosocialism. I guess one of the things that I want to bring to this discussion is also an understanding of what's happened in the past. So before I was a socialist activist, I was a climate scientist. I studied marine sediments and the fossils that collect there to understand past ocean history. So I want to start my talk by introducing you all to a catastrophic event that took place on the Earth around 12,000 years ago. At that time, the Earth was just coming out of its last ice age. An increasing amount of solar radiation was pouring into the northern hemisphere, and atmospheric greenhouse gases were rapidly increasing. Massive ice sheets that had grown over North America and Scandinavia during the preceding 100,000 years were receding rapidly, raising global sea level by hundreds of meters. Then all of a sudden, Europe was plunged back into an ice age. In the course of 2 to 3 decades, so very, very rapid, temperatures plummeted, sea ice expanded, and mountain glaciers started to grow again. The frigid conditions would persist on the Earth for another 1,300 years before warming resumed and the Earth fully emerged from the last ice age. Now, this event was first discovered by scientists looking at lake sediments. They found the fossil remains of an Arctic flower had come back again. But over time, it was actually discoveries made by scientists examining marine fossils from deep ocean sediments that helped us to better understand what likely took place. And what they found was the main cause of this abrupt climate event was the Earth getting warmer. Now, how can that be? Like, how can warming trigger a return to an ice age climate? Well, 71% of the planet is covered by ocean. So the ocean is key to regulating our climate. If you disrupt the ocean, you disrupt the climate. And that's because the ocean moves heat around the Earth by major currents. Warm water on the surface flows from the tropics to the north where it cools, it gives off heat to Europe, and then it sinks to form a deep water cold current. And this warm current is connected to the cold current like a big conveyor belt. And essentially, this conveyor belt system is how heat is transported around the Earth. So when the Earth was warming, starting around 15,000 years ago, fresh water was pouring off the land from melting ice sheets and glaciers and into the ocean, right where the deep cold current forms. And you remember, the saltier the water, the heavier. So the fresh water pouring in made the water too light to sink. And that shut down the conveyor belt and stopped the heat transport system. And this meant that heat from the tropics was no longer being moved north and a return to ice age climate. Now, after thousands of years, or about 1,000 years or so, the circulation began again, and we fully emerged from the ice age to the Holocene conditions of today. These are the conditions in which civilization was developed, in which countless cultures have been created. These are the conditions in which humans cultivated plants and animals for food and for power. I think we all understand that the relatively stable climate in ecosystems that developed over the last 10,000 years are gone. Year after year after year, more and more oil and gas is being dug up and burned, trapping more and more heat and fueling a torrent of extreme weather events. And once again, as the Earth is warming rapidly, the ice sheets are melting. Fresh water is pouring into the North Atlantic. Scientists are telling us that they're already seeing signs that the ocean's conveyor belt is slowing. New research suggests that the ocean conveyor belt could be shut down, like it was in the past, within the next few decades. Now, this wouldn't plunge us into an ice age because the conditions are just very different this time, but it would have catastrophic consequences for everybody on the Earth. Europe would become cooler, but the tropics and the whole of the southern hemisphere where you all live would get hotter, and the areas where it's too hot to live and work would expand. It would also shift the major rain belts and affect the monsoons. And that means the most important impact on all of us, on everybody on the Earth, would be on our food system. So over the last 50 years, agribusiness and big food corporations have molded our food system from what we eat, which is increasingly the global standard diet, whereby just 4 crops, wheat, rice, corn, and soy, account for almost 60% of the calories grown by farmers, to how people, access or even think about their food. And this means that locally we have more diverse food, but globally we do not. And crucially, that means that our food system is extremely vulnerable to shocks. As George Monbiot wrote in his recent book, Regenesis, which I do recommend reading, the global standard diet creates the global standard farm. And these farms are not only at risk of harvest failures, they are also monoculture dead zones for wildlife. Agriculture, not climate change, is the biggest driver of wildlife population declines and species extinction, better known as the biodiversity crisis. And that's because, firstly, their expansion has meant deforestation and destruction of ecosystems, but also year after year after year, they use huge amounts of inputs, fertilizers and pesticides that destroy the soil ecosystem, pollute our rivers and lakes, and create massive dead zones in coastal waters. These farms are also highly irrigated and are powered and fed by fossil fuels. And despite the promoted image of this small family farm, the vast majority of farms, over 70% of them, are owned or controlled by just 1% of farmers, which include investment banks, pension funds, hedge funds, and private equity vehicles. And of course, these farmers are not and never have been interested in producing nutritious food. They are interested in producing profits. So in the face of these compounding risks of abrupt climate change, of major disruptions to our food system, what has been the response of capital and governments? After decades of dragging their feet, they accept the science of climate change and biodiversity loss. But their solution, of course, is the market. We must tax ordinary people, charge them for driving their cars, tell them to stop using straws and paper cups, recycle more. They must change, not the big oil companies who are actually burning our future, nor the big tech companies building data center after data center, driving up energy needs and making it harder for us to transition to renewables. And for the actual small farmers who are already facing extreme weather events and reduced crop yields, who already don't make enough to get by, they have to change, not the big meat processing plants and grocery store giants that set the prices. And this approach to climate and biodiversity action, which says that ordinary people's lives must radically change, that you must change your life while the system causing the crisis, capitalism, is maintained. This has fueled a new climate denialism and pushed a section of people towards the far right and fascist parties. In the recent European elections, the far right finished first in France, Italy, and Austria, and came second in Germany and the Netherlands. In Ireland, the far right got into local councils for the first time, and a far right populist candidate gained a European seat for the first time. And all of this, the risk of climate tipping points, of species extinction, of more violence, death, and destruction, of the rise of the far right and fascism again, pushing back women's rights and gains for the LGBTQ community, this will only continue as long as this system is in place. Capitalism cannot get us out because capitalism equals barbarism. We and our life support systems are being sacrificed on the altar of profits for the very, very wealthy, not us. We don't benefit. So it begs the question, what should we do in the face of all of that? I think strategically, we need to place an understanding of the ecological crisis at the center of what we're doing. We are not just eco-socialists when we are campaigning about the environment and socialists the rest of the time. We are eco-socialists when we are trade unionists and housing activists. Within the trade union movement, we are the people saying the ecological crisis is a workers' issue and we need to be involved. Within the environmental movement, we are the ones pointing to the power of the organized working class and the need for system change to be eco-socialist change. Programmatically, we need to reject any promotion of growth as the answer to the crises that the majority of people on this earth face. Instead, we have to recognize that in order to sustain a livable future for humanity and for a just transition for all, the workers, small farmers, and indigenous peoples in the global south, as well as in the advanced capitalist countries, it is necessary to reduce the total energy consumption and raw materials. And that's for two reasons. Firstly, to quicken the transition to 100% renewable energy. And secondly, to avoid further breaches of the other planetary boundaries. We can't allow more and more extraction of minerals like copper, cobalt, lithium from the global south to make more and more cars for the rich countries, while their local environments and their communities are devastated. And that means that we have to degrowth to zero of energy usage on the military and advertising, drastic reductions in the incredible, disgusting consumption of the super rich with bans on private jets and yachts, to allow growth in energy usage of peoples in the global south within the planetary boundaries. It means advocating for a good life for every person on the planet. And that does not mean a superabundance of material private goods. Instead, we want high quality public goods, the decommodification of the commons and all aspects of life, and the healing of the rift between humanity and nature, an emphasis on being rather than having. We want mass retrofitting of people's homes to reduce energy consumption. We want investment in green jobs, including so-called care jobs in childcare, education, and healthcare. We want free, green, and frequent public transport, getting people out of private cars. We want universal basic services, a banning of planned obsolescence, and a shrining a right to repair of all consumer goods. We need an agricultural model ensuring the right to decent income for all farmers while shifting away from high energy intensive beef and dairy farming to low energy regenerative farming. We want a 4-day week without loss of pay, and crucially, a democratically planned economy so that we can collectively make the choice on what to spend our energy and resources on. At the beginning of the First World War, over 100 years ago, the revolutionary socialist Rosa Luxemburg, who was campaigning against that war, declared that, quote, "Today we face the choice. Either the triumph of imperialism and the collapse of all civilization, as in ancient Rome, depopulation, desolation, degeneration, a great cemetery, or the victory of socialism. That means the conscious, active struggle of the international working class against imperialism and its method of war. Today, more than 100 years later, the choice is the same. Ecosocialism, a socialism that centers the ecological crises, or barbarism. We have a choice here. The climate has changed, but every 1/10 of a degree it increases matters. Every ecosystem matters, and of course, every human life matters. We do not have to accept this rotten system which threatens everything we hold dear. We have to build the conscious, active struggle of the international working class against imperialism, to stop the destruction, to save as much as we can, but not just to defend. We must also go on the offense to build a movement, not just to tear down this system, but to build another world, an eco-socialist world.
Thank you for that, Jess. Wonder of wonders, a speaker who's on time. Hey, we might actually get to have a discussion in this session, so welcome our second speaker, Susan.
Thanks, Sue, and special thanks to Jess. It's so lovely to see you online. We've been collaborating and working together now for a few years during COVID and beyond, but we haven't ever met in person, and I really look forward to the day when we can do that either in Ireland or here in Australia. And I just wanted to also say congratulations. Jess was just elected to South Dublin City Council for People Before Profit. And as well as being a fantastic communicator of eco-socialist ideas, I know for a fact that Jess is an amazing advocate for people, and I think the city of South Dublin will be very, very grateful for the fact that she'll be out there campaigning alongside the community for their rights. Well, we live in a time of polycrisis, as they say, a climate, a biodiversity and environmental emergency, with social, economic and political shocks, war and occupation. And to say capitalism kills, it's not hyperbole, because capitalism is quite simply incompatible with life on Earth. From what Karl Marx called the original expropriation of wealth and resources by the imperialist powers in the Americas, to the enslavement of African and Indigenous peoples, to the land theft by English pastoralists on the country now called Australia, to the theft of precious drinking water by Coca-Cola and Nestle, accumulation and the pursuit of profit have outweighed respect for human life and the environment. Amid the threat of world war and nuclear annihilation, and overwhelmed by the horrors of Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, Indonesia's bloody occupation of West Papua, Morocco's ongoing occupation of Western Sahara, and Turkey's war on Rojava, the choice between eco-socialism and barbarism is sharply posed today. Well, in January, former NASA climate scientist James Hansen predicted that on current projections, by May this year, the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming ceiling would be passed for all practical purposes. And the two major factors that Hansen contributed to this were the El Niño weather pattern, but more lastingly, the decrease in the Earth's reflectivity due to diminished sea ice and cloud cover. And in his email update on May 16, Hansen confirmed this prediction based on current evidence of global warming. 1.5 degrees Celsius is the tipping point for 4 major Earth system elements: the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, the tropical coral reefs, and the abrupt thaw of the boreal permafrost. Beyond 1.5, it's likely that all these systems will start collapsing, even if we cut emissions rapidly. In June, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA as it's known, announced that global atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide had hit 421 parts per million, a 50% increase on pre-industrial times and the highest in millions of years. This is a record-breaking increase in CO2 levels over a 12-month period. And the latest reading from Mauna Loa shows the world at around 426 parts per million of CO2. And I mean, it's important to remember that CO2 levels were around 280 parts per million for almost 6,000 years of human civilization. High concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere are trapping heat, driving climate change, and resulting in more extreme weather events. This month, Egypt was hit by a heat wave that raised temperatures to 50.9 degrees Celsius, the highest temperature ever recorded in the country and in the African continent. This was preceded in late May by a heat wave that hit Pakistan and India, making them the hottest places on Earth, with air temperatures above 53 degrees. A deadly heat wave just killed 1,300 people on their pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And only a month ago, the country was hit by flash flooding in some areas. In Europe, heat-related mortality rates have risen by approximately 30% in the past 2 decades. And since the 1980s, Europe's become the fastest warming continent. Of course, that's due in part to the amount of land in Europe that's actually within the Arctic, which is the fastest warming region on Earth, but also to changing weather patterns. In Australia, 66% of all heat-related deaths occur in areas of socioeconomic disadvantage, based on the 2001 to 2018 figures. Heat waves combined with prolonged drought conditions and increased dry lightning sparked deadly fires in Chile in February, killing more than 100 people, and fires are still burning in Guatemala, in Belize, and in California. And storms that began in April this year triggered record-breaking and catastrophic flooding in Brazil's southernmost state of Rio Grande do Sul. And the ongoing climate disaster there has affected about 2 million people, left at least 170 people dead, probably much more now, and displaced more than 600,000 people. Well, while people in the global north are starting to experience the realities of climate change, of course we know for decades the peoples of the global south have been living with its consequences, and those least responsible for the emergency bear the brunt. The only way to prevent catastrophic climate change is to radically reduce greenhouse gas emissions and urgently intervene to repair and restore the climate, including drawing down existing CO2 from the atmosphere. And in addition, climate financing for mitigation and adaptation measures and technology transfers from the rich nations to the poorest nations are needed. But the biggest obstacles to such actions are the fossil fuel capitalists and the governments that do their bidding. And if we needed any more evidence as to why preventing catastrophic climate change is incompatible with capitalism, investment in renewable energy has nearly doubled. However, profits from fossil fuels are still much higher. And this is driving banks like JP Morgan, for example, to actually increase their investments in the fossil fuel industry, even though it comes at such a terrible ecological and social cost. In fact, since the Paris Agreement on climate was adopted in 2016, the world's 60 biggest banks have committed some 10.4 trillion Australian dollars to the fossil fuel industry, and governments around the world continue to subsidise the fossil fuel industry at a growing rate, to the tune of around 7 trillion US dollars, or 7.1% of world gross domestic product, according to the IMF. In Australia, these subsidies amounted to $14.5 billion in 2023-24, and this was a rise of 31% on the previous year, according to the Australia Institute. Just 100 fossil fuel corporations account for 71% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The countries of the global north are responsible for around 90% of cumulative emissions that are driving climate breakdown. Yet the global south suffers 80 to 90% of the economic cost and damages inflicted by climate breakdown, and around 99% of all climate-related deaths. Well, as we learnt thanks to the work of the late Mike Davis and others, land use change, intensive livestock production, wildlife trade and climate change are all linked to the emergence of pathogens with the potential to jump from animals to humans, such as occurred with Ebola, HIV and SARS-CoV-2, which was responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic. This took hold now 4 years ago, but it's killed 7.1 million people, according to the World Health Organization. Well, for 2023, the total global pharmaceutical market was estimated at around 1.6 trillion US dollars. This is an increase of more than $100 billion compared to the previous year, 2022. And of course, companies like Pfizer, based in New York in the United States, responsible for widely used COVID-19 vaccines, now has about 9% of the global pharmaceutical market share. Countries of the global north with strong pharmaceutical industries, like Pfizer, are currently blocking consensus within the World Health Organization for a global pandemic treaty, which would provide for nations to give access to pathogen data in exchange for automatic access to vaccines, medications, and tests developed using those data. Also being disputed in the negotiations around a treaty is a requirement that vaccines and drugs that are developed with government funding are shared more equitably than they were during the COVID-19 pandemic. And once again, it's the countries with the large pharmaceutical industries that are blocking consensus on these things. Meanwhile, avian flu, or bird flu, H5N1 as it's also known, which emerged in 1997 in China and jumped to humans in Southeast Asia, with a mortality rate of 40 to 50%, is spreading among animals, impacting on the world's biodiversity. As reported in Nature, in March this year, US health officials announced that H5N1 had been detected in dairy cows for the first time. And it has killed millions of birds, unknown numbers of mammals, particularly during the past 3 years. Animals from at least 48 species, mammal species, have died from the virus since 2020, including aquatic mammals like sea lions, porpoises and dolphins. Migratory birds have been found to be spreading the disease, and the first cases of H5 virus were detected in Antarctica in February this year, resulting in the mass deaths of penguins, among other species. There's a different strain of bird flu, the H7 strain, that's been affecting poultry farms in Australia. 1 million birds were culled in Victoria last month, and 250,000 culled or killed at an egg farm in Hawkesbury in New South Wales. And H7 has just been confirmed this week at an egg farm in the ACT. A complete overhaul of the poultry and egg production is the only way to stem bird flu, moving away from factory farming and food production, including production of ultra-processed foods, would also have positive impacts on diet and public health, as well as stem the flow of this of the bird flu. Protecting biodiversity and avoiding a 6th mass extinction requires radical moves to protect habitat from destruction for mining, grazing and development. However, capitalist economies allocate zero value to the nature that all life depends on, treating it as an externality. The best that global governments can come up with to protect biodiversity is the so-called 30 by 30 target for protecting 30% of the Earth's land and sea by 2030. But we know we need to protect 100%. Capitalism, we know, has also created regular economic crises, has distorted the development of the world, and created a handful of rich countries and a majority of poorer, super-exploited countries. The rich countries are the base for most of the giant global corporations that monopolise key sectors of the economy. The governments of these countries maintain powerful militaries to protect their global economic hegemony. And it's such a shame we can't hear from Tabitha in this session, because that's precisely what she was going to talk about. And so I really encourage comrades to come back tomorrow for the militarism panel, where we'll have a chance to explore this more. Well, we know the rich countries have launched a new arms race that not only risks escalating into nuclear war, but also drains public funds that should be used to address the climate emergency as well as pressing social needs. Faced with this existential threat, we must build movements and alliances powerful enough to challenge the power of fossil fuel capital, to take popular control over the economic levers of society, and to shift it from a market-based economic system to a needs-based economy, with people and nature at its centre. Critical industries such as energy, transportation, agriculture, and the financial institutions that invest in them need to be brought under social control. And this points to the urgent need to replace capitalism with an eco-socialist society, one which could address gross injustices and repair capitalism's rift with nature and humanity's rift with nature. And the corporate rich that now rule the world, we know, stole much of their starting capital, directly or indirectly, through colonial plunder. They destroyed numerous societies around the globe, many of which were organised for thousands of years around indigenous social values of egalitarianism, of cooperation, of coexistence with nature. An eco-socialist future would require a return to these principles, with the benefit of technological advances used for social good, and human creativity that's liberated from the drudgery of long working hours, and grassroots democracy that allows communities to have control over their destinies. The movement in solidarity with Palestine reminds us that historically, people's political consciousness can develop rapidly in the process of sustained collective struggle, and that such movements act as schools of direct democracy. They can also give birth to new institutions of popular democracy. Therefore, it's critical that we build mass movements around immediate demands and transitional measures that point a way beyond capitalism. In the context of the climate emergency, such measures could take the form of a radical Green New Deal, or the push for universal adoption of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, to scale down the fossil fuel industry on a binding annual schedule, while enabling countries of the Global South to access the energy they need for development, as Jess has already alluded to. It could also include the demand for the Global North to compensate the Global South for the additional mitigation costs that climate change imposes on them. These are estimated at around $192 trillion between now and 2050, which could be paid for by a wealth tax, targeting the richest 10% in the global north. Well, Socialist Alliance seeks to build such a movement and to utilise whatever platform and means we can to popularise it, including through electoral campaigns. But we also understand that only an independent mass movement that mobilises beyond the limits of electoral campaigns has potential to realise such transitional measures and demands to change the system. So please join us in building that movement. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. Well, now we've got quite a bit of time to have a discussion. Before I get people to indicate, if you haven't got this week's Green Left, you should get it, because on the back page it says Ecosocialism, not just a good idea, a necessity, which is exactly what both of our speakers have reflected that. Oh, well done, Anne. So I think this is one of those areas where almost everybody's got a point of view and would like to make a contribution. What I'm going to do is take 3 at a time. If there's questions in there, we'll revert back to our 2 speakers and see if they'd like to answer. If not, we'll go on with the other 3. So, so think about what you're going to say. Try not to talk too long, because the more people that can have a say would be better. So I've got Anne followed by Sue, and you're number 3. So, would you mind coming up just so that... Oh, thank you.
I do have a big voice, but yes, I have this T-shirt. No, I haven't given up. But it's also very depressing to think that in 1975, nearly 50 years ago, there were 600 people at the Radical Ecology Conference discussing precisely these issues. And what happened to them? It was a fantastic conference, 4 overseas speakers, one of the best conferences I've ever been to, and it didn't carry on. So none of this is new. I joined the Communist Party, the Australian Communist Party, in 1972, saying, I'm not a Marxist, I never will be a Marxist, but ecological sustainability is not compatible with capitalism. And it's still not the case. And what's happened in the meantime? Neoliberalism's happened, and the whole focus on individuality and looking after yourself and your family. I think the other thing is, I'm personally perhaps more of a deep ecologist. I think we have to look at other ways of living than in big cities where the food production is elsewhere. Because if you don't want to have bloody masses of chickens in large areas or even cages or whatever, then the alternative is for people to have more chickens in their backyards or more smaller scales living. So I'm putting a plea for deeper ecological understanding of how we grow our food, how we move. I mean, we used to say, the figures that Pip gave, we used to give the figures that back then that about 20% of the world's population use 80% of the world's resources and produce 80% of the world's pollution. It's probably more now like 85 and 15%, so in some ways, we haven't moved. Why was it we could have 600 people 50 years ago? What happened to them, and what do we need to do now? And I just say, I haven't given up. I'm still fighting, as you can see, but at times it's very easy to get depressed. And one of my most popular badges is the one that says, are humans a civilised species? We'd have difficulty convincing aliens. Because, look at what we're doing to our climate and to our society. And, I could go on about, the fact that 30,000, we're all very upset about Palestine, but 30 or 40,000 people die every day of starvation. Why aren't we out in the streets about them? So I'm sorry, I'm not asking a question, and I'm not even offering a way forward, but just to say that we've got to keeping on and somehow look back to the past and what we didn't do, what didn't we do then that we have to do now. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks, Anne.
Thanks. So I've got 2 questions for the speakers or anyone else in the audience who wants to answer. One is about the question of the market and renewable energy, I'm thinking in particular, because certainly in Australia, I don't know if this is the case around the world, but we've got a privatised energy industry, and I think now there's a lot of climate activists or a lot of people who support climate action who are so happy that there's now private enterprise producing renewable energy that they sort of think, well, maybe the market can resolve the question of energy. But we've got another debate in Australia where renewable energy owned by private corporations is creating industrial scale renewable energy projects, some of which are going through important wildlife areas like koala important koala areas. And there's and I think this is because it's private enterprise, private corporations where they're not thinking about what's the most appropriate place for a renewable energy plant, or wind farm or solar farm or whatever. They're just thinking about where it's going to be most profitable to put and incompatible technologies. The other thing is the fact that so the second question is about military and war, because military emissions were excluded from the Kyoto Protocol. I'm assuming they're still excluded. And why is there no hubbub about the fact that the bombardment of Gaza would be absolutely fucking the climate, both with emissions but also with the misuse of resources to create killing machines? And like this is, I mean, okay, it's sort of hard to talk about that element when, you know, the direct killing and starvation of people of Gaza is in front of us. But this is a climate disaster, what's happening in Gaza, as well as all the other wars that are happening around the world, and why they're not trying to fucking end, well, we know why they're not trying to end the genocide, because they want to the economic domination of the Middle East. But anyway, that's it. So comments from anyone?
Oh, thanks, Sue. Great question. Now, I'm going to hand back after... Sorry, what's your name? Harper. After Harper, I'm going to ask the two speakers to comment upon your question, Sue.
So my question revolves around eco-socialism. From what the two speakers have said, it sounds amazing, but my question is, how do we get there? Obviously, the most important step is joining Socialist Alliance, but other than that, I mean...
That's a great question, Harper. Now, what we'll do is we'll go back to Jess first, and then Susan. So, Jess, would you like to answer any of those?
Yeah, good big questions. Just on the question of the market and people feeling like, well, at least somebody's building renewable energy, right? We have to support that. We had a bit of a debate here in Ireland that featured in our magazine. You know, should we ally with so-called green capitalists? You know, those that are building wind power, solar energy, all of that. You know, shouldn't we be with them against fossil fuel capital, because we need to transition, we need to do it quickly? And our response to that is no, absolutely not. Absolutely, we need renewable energy, but it does matter how it gets built. It does matter where it gets built. Here in Ireland, the private wind companies are building on boglands, which are like the rainforests here in Ireland. They are so ecologically important, and for over 100 years, they have been used as fuel, basically. People dig them up and burn them, you know. But we need to ensure the rewetting of our bogs. We need to protect our bogs. They're important stores for carbon. We should not be building wind farms on them. But that's what private companies are doing. The land is cheap. That's where they want to build. It's the same in the ocean. They want to build wind farms right where you have ecologically sensitive areas that actually should be protected. But, you know, the government isn't doing anything about this. And so it's to the local communities to object to it. And often the local communities are objecting to it because, you know, it's right on their doorstep. They don't want that, but they're also not benefiting from it. Many of these projects are going to power data centers. They're not even going to power our homes. They're not going to reduce our energy needs and our energy costs. They're just going to the big behemoths that are driving up our energy needs. And so it does matter where renewable energy is being constructed, and also who is constructing it and for what purpose. And so, yeah, we do see an increase in renewable energy, and that's wonderful, and we need more of it. But we want it to be community owned and controlled, and we want to ensure that it's put in a place that's not going to destroy the local environment and ecosystems, you know, because we don't want to have climate tunnel vision and just think about emissions. We also need to consider all the other issues that make up the whole of the ecological crises, the biodiversity crisis, the issue with water pollution, all of that. So I do think you know, the question of the market is very, very important. And while we need renewable energy, we actually should be against private ownership of this new renewable energy. It is a major issue that we're fighting back here in Ireland. And it's interesting because the Green Party here, which is in government with the right-wing parties, like they are for private industry coming in and building this renewable energy, and they claim it as a success and don't understand that it undermines our ability to build the movement necessary to actually transition the whole of society away from fossil fuels and away from a high consumption lifestyle that actually doesn't benefit us. But you know, that's another question. Just on the genocide in Gaza and the question of the environmental impact and emissions, I really agree with the speaker there. I think there has been a failure from big sections of the environmental movement to identify the environmental impact and the increase in emissions, the waste of resources, all the things that the speaker had identified. We had a meeting, the Global Ecosocialist Network that Susan and I worked together in, had a meeting on this topic. An ecologist from Palestine that I think was touring Australia was graciously came to our meeting to kind of explain the ecological impact in Gaza as well as in the West Bank over decades from Israeli occupation, but also the ongoing genocide today and what is the impact. And it is quite a failure of the environmental movement, big sections of it, to not identify this and stand against the genocide also because of environmental reasons. And it is to the credit of, you know, somebody like Greta Thunberg that she has stood with Palestine and has given a lead to the environmental movement, the youth movement, that, you know, we have to stand with Palestine, that we have to stand for liberation, and it is for justice for all. And we can't have climate justice when a whole section of, you know, humanity is being wiped out and their environment destroyed. So I really agree about that. And just lastly, on the question of like, how do we get there? I don't know. I mean, that is the main question for us. I can only say from my own experience that I think it is vitally important, particularly in the here and now, where you have the rise of the far right in Europe, and you have, you know, fascism on the cards again, particularly in Europe, taking power in big states, and the threat to our rights, our lives, our environment, pushing back the small regulations that we have been able to win on environmental pollution and all of that. It is vitally important that we connect with our local communities and be incredible fighters for their everyday needs. And that's housing, that's public services, and that within those struggles, as I mentioned in my talk, we connect that to the environmental and ecological crises at large. And we help people understand that it actually is capital, you know, that it's capitalism, but it is the big corporations that are benefiting from the fact that you can't get housing, and that, you know, you have 3 generations all living in one cramped house, that your public services are going away, and that you have a long wait before you can see a doctor. All of that is connected. And with us in Ireland, we actually have a huge agricultural sector. It is one of the major parts of our indigenous economy. Those farmers are being attracted to the far right for all the reasons that I mentioned in my talk. But it is important that we connect climate change to the problems that they're facing, as well as pointing to the power of capital to determine their fate, to determine the fact that they can't make enough money to feed their family. It doesn't mean they're going to listen to us right now. I don't think that they will, but we have to talk about those things. But I do think in the here and now, it is important that we're fighting on the local campaigns, and that we have a relevance to people's lives, that it isn't just for this eco-socialist future that we're fighting for, this horizon that looks so far in the future and doesn't even feel like it's possible when you consider Trump potentially winning in the US and far-right parties gaining so much across Europe. It doesn't feel like it's possible, particularly for a lot of young people, I can imagine, or even people who have been around for decades and have seen waves of struggle much bigger than today. But I do think, like, because of that, it is important that we do the local campaigning work, that we are relevant in the here and now, and we are fighting in the here and now for the things that people need, but connect that to the bigger project of an eco-socialist future. I know that's not really a satisfying answer. You know, I've been at this for a little over a decade, and it's very frustrating because when I started, It was, the Occupy Wall Street movement. At that time, it felt like, oh my gosh, everybody is rising up, and you don't have a sense of history. You don't understand it actually, that wave of movements was smaller than the wave before that, and that was smaller than the wave before that, and that we're facing like historic defeats. But, it felt like you were part of something. So yes, join a socialist organization. But I do think getting into the work on the ground and in the community is actually where we start to build the links, we start to build the roots, and we build our power.
So I'm going to let Susan respond as well.
I won't say too much because I think Jess has done such a fantastic job of taking up all those questions. I guess, and to answer your comments, I think the most inspiring thing about the climate movement of the past 6 years has been the youth, really. And I think the COVID pandemic really interrupted the rise of a mass climate movement, and we still haven't recovered from that. But I think that what COVID did, and I think now, as Jess mentioned, even the comments by people like Greta Thunberg on the question of Palestine indicate to me that a new movement is being built, but on a much higher level. I think people, I totally respect people who have deep ecology as their kind of starting point, but I guess what really inspires me is the fact that intersectional politics, if you like, if you want to put it in that framework, has meant that environmentalists taking up social issues, taking up the issue of the war in Palestine, and not just because of its ecological consequences, but because developing an anti-imperialist analysis, an understanding of the role of imperialism, colonialism in our world, and how that links to ecological devastation. I mean, you only have to read Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America. I hope I got that right. That's to understand the very, very direct connection between colonialism and environmental destruction, or John Bellamy Foster's works. Everything is connected, that's the thing. And I think that's what gives me hope, is that that the movements today are making those connections. Why haven't we gone further? Yes, neoliberalism, absolutely. It's a new offensive. I think the system of the COP, the Conference of the Parties, has, where you have non-binding targets for emissions. There are a lot of problems, a lot of limitations with the international institutions that are supposed to be guiding us to a safe climate. But we understand why. I think those of us in the room, you just take a look at the last COP to see that fossil fuel capital, has captured a lot of these processes now, where they're full of lobbyists, more lobbyists than climate scientists these days, more fossil fuel, executives than climate scientists. So we have serious limitations there. So I guess, in terms of how to get there, I think the value of joining an eco-socialist organisation, a socialist organisation, is because you can, join with others in learning the history, learning from the experiences of the past, drawing the lessons so that we don't repeat mistakes, hopefully, as we continue the struggle. That's the advantage, certainly, and why I absolutely recommend you join Socialist Alliance. But I totally agree with Jess. I think it's not enough, because it's not just enough to be part of a group with like-minded people and just all feel good about being in the room together, like we're all feeling really good about being in the room together today. It is about what happens after this conference and what we actually go on to do, and what we've done prior to this conference. We've been out there on the street campaigning, working with First Nations activists, working alongside communities, working within the Disrupt Borough Pub campaign. These are such important, critical struggles that socialists need to be a part of. And I think we understand that. And while we're working alongside people, we're having the discussions. People are drawing the conclusions about capitalism and how it's completely destroying our planet. That the relationship between colonialism in Australia and environmental destruction is very clear. The relationship between the power of the fossil fuel companies and where we are today, and why arguments about how the market will fix it and that we can just green capitalism or give capitalism a smiley face is not going to cut it today. No. And I think less and less people have illusions in that. They certainly have a lot less illusions in democracy today, so-called parliamentary democracy, than they do, and they have a lot less illusions in the idea of the West being some kind of, beacon of democratic human rights, respect for human rights, etc. I think all of those veils are coming down, and so we've got to keep on doing what we're doing. But I think people are with us. Okay, YouGov is a poll of 1,500 people, but the results of the latest YouGov poll, in terms of the views of Australians between the ages of 18 to 24, who want Australia to have more socialism, if you like, or socialist policies, socialist approaches, than capitalism today. Now that tells you something. Socialism might mean a hell of a lot of different things to everybody who answered that question, but it tells you that people, and particularly young people, understand what's happening in the world. They're looking for an alternative. It's up to us to get out there and present that alternative on whatever platform, whatever way we can, because it is a battle, as Jess said, for hearts and minds, particularly the more desperate people are feeling about the cost of living. The vulnerabilities out there in the community amongst the working class is really fertile ground for the far right. And we have to understand that. We're in a serious battle here for hearts and minds, and a serious battle to either take one of two alternatives of the fork in the road to eco-socialism or barbarism today. We have to understand that. It's a serious, serious fight that we're engaged in.
Thanks, Susan. Okay, I've got to take another three, and Khaled, you've already got your hand on the microphone, so you're first. But don't go yet, I've got two more to choose. And I'm going to go Jacob and then Nova.
Hi. I'm very happy, for all what I heard from you, but I will tell you some success story in Gaza, because I'm working with resistance there in terms of food. First one was in the springtime, like in March, we tried to grow planets like chickpeas and some food. But the planets was, when it's grow up, because the Israeli spray all the agriculture area with purple color, we don't know what is it. When the planets go just 2 centi, it will start dying. And our elder mothers said, just boil onion and put it in it. And after that, it's work. The other thing is about what we have is big projects, we are doing it about the wells, water wells. Israel destroyed all the water wells in Gaza, and what we found, they pump salt water with it. So, but we did something else. We go from another way, not from where the well, from close by, and we build a new well. And we successfully, now, I can tell you, Gaza City is drinking water from the wells, which is good. The third project we are doing is about the seaweed, because we've seen people are trying to do fishing, but when we go to the sea, there is no fish. And the people saying there isn't food for the fish, all the fish die, or all the fish run away. And now we have secret area where we're growing up the seaweed, but till now we don't put it in the sea. And the last one is about what we call it wild animal. It's not wild animal, it's our street animal, like the birds and the dogs and the cats in the roads. Now, in each city, we have groups who's putting food for them to keep them there, not to run away. What we are trying to do is just temporary work, but we need your help after the war because really there is a crisis. What we are looking for just to survive, and like, yeah, I link it all with food and water, and not just for us, also for our animal. But there is big crisis in Gaza because Israeli like spray all the area with something. No, there isn't no life in it, and all the birds run away from it.
Jacob? In the back.
Yeah, so I want to expand, I guess, on some of these comments, I guess, on, you know, what is to kind of be done, you know, how do we get to kind of an eco-socialist future? And I kind of understand, you know, some of the comments. I mean, it's kind of recurring kind of comment that's kind of held on the left, that, you know, the left is very weak. The far right does seem to be on the ascend. I mean, it is very much on the ascend, as we can look at the developments that kind of in Europe. But I guess my response is, I mean, as a committed socialist and also a member of Socialist Alliance, is we really have no alternative other than building a fighting organisation committed to the overthrow of capitalism, but in the immediate term, building the movements of against injustice. Because you have to look at what the status quo is doing. The current status quo, the Labor Party, is presenting a terrible climate policy that essentially is just propping up fossil fuel capitalists, but also at the same time propping up this whole idea of green capitalism, which actually at the end of the day is always at the cost of people in the global south. Just think about all the kind of expansion of the renewable energy, the people whose lands that's getting cleared in favour for are peasants in India. The other aspect as well is we also have to think about what we would ideally like to see. And of course, in a sense, we would have been in a much better situation if the climate movement was consistent about mobilising, if it was consistent about mobilising against any kind of government policy around climate inaction, because in actual fact, the Labor Party feels no pressure on the question of the climate, because in a sense, we are almost buying into a lot of people are sort of buying into the idea that, well, actually the government and the experts are just going to resolve the crisis for us. Well, no, they're not. The only way it's actually going to be resolved is through people power. It's through building that the self-organisation of ordinary people, because we're the ones who actually, in a sense, part of running society, and we actually have the solutions, because the technocrats, the capitalist politicians, they don't offer any solutions. So really, we have to be optimistic. The only alternative is we have to build a fighting left.
Hello? Okay. Excellent speech. I loved it. It took me right back to many of the degrowth books that I've read over the last few weeks. One thing I wanted to, I guess, reflect on a little bit was sort of how far we are on that path towards climate fascism already. You mentioned many European examples where the far right is winning seats already. But in a Western Australian context, we have essentially complete state capture, where our politicians have said, if the ecological regulations stop Woodside from going ahead, then we're going to basically reverse the ecological regulations to begin with. We have Woodside sponsors basically everything. If we were any further along the way to state capture of Woodside, of the Western Australian government by Woodside, then they'd be sponsoring our bloody welfare pensions. In addition to this, the right, in particular, does not have a policy to deal with climate change. They'd rather just pretend it doesn't exist. We'll just build nuclear because we want to advance Australia's nuclear interests. And in order to do that, that's not a very popular opinion in today's economy. in today's political landscape. So they have to rely upon beating on minorities, and we're seeing a huge wave of hate directed particularly towards trans people in the United States, throughout Europe, and indeed it's come to Western Australia, and will be a significant issue in the 2015 elections. So I just 2025 elections. So yeah, I just would like to hear more reflections about how far along the way we are to climate fascism.
What I might do now for our next three is just see if any of our international guests would like to make a contribution. Would any of you? No, have a think about it. So I'm going to go to Sarah, and then keep forgetting that. Jim and comrade, I've forgotten your name. Nico. Sorry, Nico.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks to our speakers. I guess I wanted to take this from the macro down to the micro and, surprise, surprise, talk about local council. But yeah, I've been surprised in a good way that how much is being done in the local council space. And I know this is probably varies state to state in terms of what local council has coverage over as opposed to what the state government might be responsible for. But some of the things I've picked up in Geelong is so Geelong City Council kind of oversees street canopy coverage and has a goal in terms of increasing street canopy tree planting. There's this thing about 1 million trees. It's very aspirational, but it's something that they're working on. There's a policy that's recently just gone out to community consultation about verge gardens, so being able to actually plant a veggie garden in your nature strip. Stuff like that. And this has all been sort of community grassroots driven, and then council's kind of been dragged along the way over, and nothing moves quickly. Everything takes like a full term of council to get to that point of strategy going out. But yeah, I'd be keen to hear, I guess, other examples if there is things happening at a local council level. I know we've got different campaigns happening in different states at this level, but I just feel like sometimes when we're talking about these really big picture things, and climate really is the perennial like big picture thing, that sometimes we might forget that there are some real practical things that we can drill down to. And you know, I'm not going to say local council's the be all and end all, but I feel like it's that most accessible layer of any government that you can tap into. You can go to city council meetings, you can front your local councillors, they live in our communities. And Jess, congratulations on being elected to council, but more socialists on council. I'd be keen to hear from yourself, Jess, if there were particular things on your platform that you ran on that sort of fit into this environment, climate space that you're wanting to take into the council level, or just ideas that you might have general. We've got, I think, myself and Sue in the room, so yeah, ideas for other socialists on local council that we might be able to take up. Thanks.
Jess, we will go to you in a minute, but we'll go to Jim and then Nico.
Thanks very much, Jess and Susan, and for the discussion, which is very crucial. I just want to mention, or it's already come up, but one thing we need to be wary about is the intersection of climate denialism and the culture wars. And that's what's coming up very strongly in Australia at the moment. First and foremost with Peter Dutton's thought bubble about nuclear suddenly out of the past, out of the dim past. In Australia we haven't had a discussion about nuclear power in this country since it was banned years ago as a result of the nuclear debate of the past. But one of the concerns that I have is first of all that raising the nuclear option, as a number of climate organisations have pointed out, its main purpose is not actually even to ever build these things, which are kind of white elephants of the future, but to sideline the introduction of renewables. And that's that's actually what Dutton and co are doing. And another aspect of the culture wars is this, which we have to be aware of. And of course, it's very important that things like wind farms and so on are built on, in a correct way. But we do need to be aware there's a very conscious right-wing program to attack them, and we've seen that in Australia. For example, off the south coast in New South Wales, there's a right-wing campaign which is run on the basis that wind farms are going to kill whales, wind farms are going to kill birds, and even that wind farms will prevent surfing because they're going to stop the waves coming in, and things like that. This was the campaign that was mounted and had the Surfers Association joining in with One Nation and the National Party in Wollongong. And the same things happen on the North Coast. And they brought up all sorts of ridiculous things. So I think that's a concern that we need to have in this current discussion. Yes, we need wind farms to be in the right place and to be sensitive to the environment, but be aware the right wing are on a conscious campaign to run down the idea of wind farms and solar, where, by the way, Australia has the best possibility of solar. We could power the whole of Southeast Asia by putting solar farms in areas. Finally, I just want to, just on the point of what's happening with the climate movement, I just want to point out that these things go in waves. And I would remind people in 2019 we had the largest rallies, the high school walkouts, which brought 100,000 people, 200,000 people into the streets. And that is temporarily on the sideline, but there is a movement going on, and I really want to give a big plug, this is what I'm using this build-up for the blockade of Newcastle. November, I know it's a long way from Perth, but bear it in mind, you can save up. It's November 9th, what is it? It's a 10-day one this time. They want to get 10,000 people to blockade, and those that went there last year, what a fantastic event it was. It was absolutely brilliant. We got 3,000, and they want 10,000. It's November 19 to 28. So put that in your diary and come along, please. Thank you.
Yes, but Nico is sitting right behind you, and he's from Newcastle.
Actually, is this working? Yeah. This is exactly what I was going to raise. Was the rising tide? As far as how do we get there is concerned, the Rising Tide campaign is very, very specific. It's aiming to stop all coal exports from the Port of Newcastle by 2030. The Port of Newcastle in Australia is the largest, the port which exports the most amount of coal in the world. So we're the centre of coal exports. And this year it will be, as Jim said, 10,000 people over 10 days. Last year we did 3,000 over 3 days. We can't stop, and the extraordinary thing about the movement in terms of how do we get there in the long run is that it is so local, it is so achievable. So it's one of those targets that gradually other bits and pieces are falling into place. So the Hunter region in Newcastle, around Newcastle, also has is creating a Newcastle Energy Transition Authority. So at the same time as we're like taking this very direct action to stop coal exports, at the same time, all of a sudden, there is a lot of action taking place to plan for the transition to a renewables economy. And the extraordinary thing is the amount of like public participation, people coming on board saying, this is great, you know, what you're suggesting is not far-fetched, this is achievable. So here in WA, you've got the Burrup Hub campaign. I think that thing of very specific campaigns that attract people to the movement is definitely an avenue worth pursuing. Thank you.
I have to say, Rising Tide is a fantastic experience. So if you if you live near there or if you've got some spare cash, I'll never forget 100 people chose to be arrested. One of them was Father Christmas. And he, after being detained, he came out and he said, oh shit, I've left my sack in there. So he returned to prison to get his sack. But anyway, I reckon we've probably got time for 2 more speakers, and then we'll flick back to Jess and Susan, because there's a lot of issues that have been raised, and that should probably do us. And to be honest, the first hands I saw were Pip and Maz. So we'll go with you two. Sorry to the rest, but plenty of time to talk over dinner.
Thanks very much for the presentations. I guess I'm curious about what the trade union involvement in the climate campaign is in Ireland, because frankly it hasn't been consistent, to put it politely, in Australia. We have wall-to-wall Labor governments that work very closely with the unions, and to be honest, some of them probably have got some good policy on the books, but you do not see them in any consistent fashion out in the streets, apart from when there's black summer, we have, bushfires and there's an emergency response. So I guess, I think there's the connection between the climate, there's a lack of institutional support, I would say, in Australia for the climate movement, and that connects to the discussion about the next stage, which I totally agree with you about the need for the next stage of the energy revolution having to be in public hands. And so this is where unions are getting snared, because they're having to support private wind farms, private renewable projects, because that's the only thing that's on offer, and they don't want to go up against a Labor government and say, we need it to be in public hands.
Maz, down here.
Yeah, thank you. My comment is really in response to what the gentleman over there said about surfers and stuff organising against wind farms. And I think what that really shows is the power of community organising and meeting people where they're at. So if you went to those surfers and talked about the impact of climate change on water levels, oceans, ocean health, maybe they'd be more easily swayed to our side. And maybe where the alt-right are winning is that they're actually meeting people where they're at, and we need to basically do the same, and just in a more organised and coordinated way.
Okay. Well, we'll go now to Jess and then Susan for final responses. Jess?
Thanks very much for everybody's comments. Really interesting discussion, and I think we could probably stay here for another hour and discuss even more aspects of the issues that we face. So I just answer some of the questions and make a final comment. Firstly, on the trade unions in Ireland, social partnership has dominated the organised workers movement here, I think, since the crash. So I'm only living in Ireland about 8 years. I'm originally from America. And there doesn't really appear to be any organized trade union grouping that really brings the ecological crises into the trade union movement and then helps to organize the trade union movement to be a part of the climate movement. So when Extinction Rebellion was a big force a few years ago, I and others that were, trade union activists formed an Extinction Rebellion trade union grouping, but it was tiny, and it really, the impact was just tiny. It was trying to show the environmental movement that it was important to connect with the workers movement, but it really is quite an uphill battle here. I mean, just for example, the energy system here in Ireland used to be publicly owned, but then it was privatized, and it's now made the most expensive energy in, I think, the EU. But energy workers themselves have not yet made the connection of the need to push things back into public ownership, to make that part of their demands whenever they're getting organized for their wages and conditions. They're wholly focused on their workplace conditions and their wages, and that's understandable. So we have a lot of work left to do here with the trade unions. We did have some connection with them when the bus workers were going on strike, and the rail workers were on strike after the crash first, and they got a lot of abuse for that, and it was the socialists standing with them. But they did help to break the dam and open up the space for other workers to go on strike, to get their wages and conditions restored since the crash. And so we did try to make connections with them then, but it is very hard to make the argument about free public transport for transport workers whenever they feel like that'll cut into their wages. So there's a lot of work left to be done. And I want to encourage people to look at the example coming from Germany of the We Ride Together campaign, where climate activists have been working for a number of years alongside transport workers, supporting them in their strike, and then asking for solidarity in the climate strike. And recently they held 2 strikes together, where the workers and the climate movement together were striking for better public services, better paying conditions. And I think it's an example that we can build off of. The question on how far along the road to fascism, I don't know. It's really uneven, it's hard to get a sense. Like in France, it's highly organized in France. I think everybody understands that. They could potentially win the election. 20 years ago, within the European Parliament, the far right really struggled to even form a parliamentary group, because you had to have at least 7 MEPs to have a group. And they just weren't able to do it. But today, they have 2 large parliamentary groups. And if they would unite, they would actually constitute the 2nd strongest political force in the entire European Parliament. And we know what they're going to do in terms of going after the nature restoration law and trying to roll back, the regulations we were able to win on big agribusiness and fossil fuel consumption and extraction and all of that. They won on the basis of what one of the audience commented on, that huge wave of hate. They did, particularly against migrants coming to the EU. The wave of solidarity we saw in Europe after that image of that 3-year-old little boy lying dead on the beach has been replaced by this wave of hate. This feeling that we aren't going to get the housing we need. We're not going to get the public services we need. So we need to close the borders. We need to reinforce Fortress Europe. And we need to create detention centers at ports and airports to hold, not just adults, children, and to ensure they're processed and quickly deported. I mean, it was just absolutely disgusting here in Ireland about how the media had a drumbeat on migration, just talking about it. You turn on the radio, it's migration. You open the newspaper, it's migration. And so, of course, on the doors, that's what people were talking to you about. It's not fair they're getting benefits, and we don't have our own being housed. It's not fair they're getting this or that. I mean, it was just absolutely disgusting how the center-right parties opened that door to the far right. And I agree about also attacking trans people. I mean, what's happening in the US is really scary. And I'm, I guess, a bit optimistic to see some of that being defeated, and the movements that are being built to defeat the attack on trans people shows how the movement has risen to a higher level. And there is an understanding of the need for solidarity, that if they go after them, they're coming after us, and that an injury to one is an injury to all. But nonetheless, it is pretty worrying about what's happening. And like I mentioned before, it does look likely that Trump could win in the US, and that will strengthen the far right all over the world to see the most powerful country on the planet being run by somebody like that again. I also have to point out that, this space is being created not just by traditional establishment right-wing parties, but also the Green parties in Europe that have been empowered, that have propped up right-wing parties, establishment parties, in Ireland, in Germany, and a number of countries. They are in power. And, people see that. And they see that you're sacrificing our housing, our public services, justice for, you know, women, for LGBTQ people, all of that. You're sacrificing that for what? Cycle lanes? That's the situation in Ireland. That's what it feels like, you know, for ordinary people. And just on the question of, you know, what do you do as a local councillor? What kind of campaigning can you do on climate? I mean, it's interesting when we talk to people on the doors, they really hated cycle lanes. And I cycle. I like my cycle lanes. I want more of them. I want them to be all connected up. I want to be able to like put my child on the back of my bike and not feel like I'm going to get run over. So cycle lanes are good. But one of the problems that we face with this, and it is the problem with neoliberal governments the world over implementing climate action, they are not democratically doing it, and they're not talking to people about this stuff. It just happens. So when your road is torn up and a cycle lane is put in and you yourself don't cycle and nobody's talking to you and there isn't a conversation about the importance of getting out of cars and how to make this work for everybody, well, yeah, you're going to hate that. And you're going to blame the Green Party and you're going to blame climate action and you're going to be open to a new wave of climate denialism. So I do think as local councillors, as people on the ground talking to people, we should not be giving in an opportunist way to like, yeah, you know, I agree with you. We need to be angry. Let's just be angry at the government. You have to be angry at the lack of consultation and the lack of democracy and talk about how we want more democracy. We want more conversation and that ordinary people need to be at the center of how we, you know, determine what happens, where it happens, and when it happens. And I think if we do that, you know, that's the optimism of a socialist, that if you put people in power, that they will make the right decisions. And I really am optimistic about that. I also think, you know, in talking about the wave of the far right in Europe, we need to kind of contrast that with the fact that Bolsonaro was defeated. You know, a coup was just defeated in Bolivia. There's a mass movement that just defeated taxes in Kenya, you know. Before COVID, there were mass movements all over the world. I can't even remember them. I tried to look them up, but I remember they're in Haiti, in Chile, in Sudan, and Lebanon. And just over the last decade, a new feminist wave in Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, the Spanish state, Ireland, you know, Switzerland, South Korea, all over. So we should not just look at the rise of the far right. We also have to look at the rise of the left and the mass movements that are necessary to bring down this system. And I agree, just finally, on what one of the audience members said about we don't have any other choice. I really agree. Like, it's super hard work. It takes a lot of sacrifice. I had a child last year. Oh my God, is it really hard to raise a family while you're also spending like all of your energy and time trying to build movements? But there is no other way. There is no shortcut. We have to help rebuild the mass movements that are necessary for people to have a chance to connect, to take to the streets, to come together as one, to feel their strength, to understand their power, to use their power, and to build their confidence to finally take power.
Thank you, Jess. And Susan?
Whew. Thanks, Jess. Now, what did I want to say? I wanted to talk about a couple of things. Nova raised the question of ecofascism too, and I think that the response of far-right governments to the environmental crisis is going to be to push that responsibility down onto working people, to those with the least power in society, to all of those who've been displaced by climate change. I mean, you just look at the amount of refugees right now that have been displaced by a war, and those wars have often been caused by the struggle for resources due to drought and climate change. So we're already in that situation. And what has been the response of our government, of European governments, of governments across the global north, has been to close the borders. You know, that is a form of, you could say, an eco-fascist response to climate change. And that's not to say that the far right can't present itself as being pro-environment, etc. But it's just that, of course, we know the solutions are going to be unpalatable to ordinary people. Well, they're going to be, we're going to be the ones copying it. Sustainable population is one of those, kind of Trojan horses in this whole discussion. Where I think the debate amongst ecologists is really sharp on this question of, what kind of population can the Earth support, or what kind of population can Australia support? And I think it's up to us as socialists, as humanitarians, as internationalists, to put the arguments about why we should be welcoming refugees into our country. That it's not a question of a lack of resources, but of who controls those resources, how they're distributed in society. On the question Jim raised about nukes, and absolutely it's true. It's, this whole question is really, because we know nuclear power plants, if they were to be built, couldn't be built straight away. So what do you do in the meantime? Continue, producing coal and gas, or particularly gas. But you look at what's happening in Scarborough, in the Burrup hub, and you realise that, any talk now of gas being a sort of clean, green transition fuel, which should be just thrown out the window. It's not, clearly. But the problem is that, of course, the Labor government have opened themselves up to this because of the AUKUS agreement. Once you open the door to having nuclear-powered submarines in your waters, well, how are you going to, how's that going to happen? What's the process going to be? So there's already a weakening of the legal framework around nuclear radiation and protection of the environment as a result of AUKUS. So Dutton's just exploiting. He's exploiting that crack. On the question of, jobs versus the environment and the lack of trade union involvement, it has been a really long-standing problem here. And sadly, it's only been when trade unions, particularly in the white-collar industries, have had the guts and some political leadership to kind of lead the charge, that's helped to open up a discussion again. But the challenge really still remains very much with the blue-collar unions. And that's because Australia is, it's a wealthy country on the back of a mining and energy industry. And so, like the argument around nuclear, we're going to close down these coal-fired power stations, but we'll build a nuclear power station in your community so that the people can just transition into jobs in that industry. And, people will accept those arguments unless they're challenged. So, just like that, we've got to put the arguments about transitions to renewable energy and what that's going to mean. The fact that, mining jobs are a small proportion of the labour force overall, but yet get, elevated into such, you'd think they were 60% of the labour force, the way they get talked about in the media. Anyway, there's, so it needs political leadership within the union movement, and that is lacking too. And I think we've got to do what we can there to intervene, not just to work with others in the labour movement who share our ideas, but also do what we can in our own unions to push this point, to push the question of sustainability, of transition to renewables, of just transitions for communities, for workers, without loss of pay, being able to get freely educated and trained into new industries that are actually going to provide sustainable jobs into the future. This is important. Or down to things like factory occupations. There's a comrade here who was showing a few of us a fantastic article about workers in Europe taking over a factory to produce, renewable energy technology. In some instances it will come down to that. But, you've got to, we're not going to get to that point just yet. It's going to be a slow build of doing a lot of the hard, patient work of talking to people one-on-one, doing the work inside our unions, raising the issues, and also I think renewing our unions and breaking the ties with Labor, because that's part of the problem. Labor's in government right now. And so the unions are particularly reticent to rock the boat. And that is a real political challenge that we face today. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Thanks, Judy. Yes, thank you to Jess and Susan. They were great contributions that actually led to a really wonderful discussion. So Can we have a clap, please, for everyone? And sorry if you didn't get to ask a question, don't be fearful, or don't be upset. Tomorrow at 3:30, there's another workshop on how can we win climate justice. So make sure you put that one in your diary if you're not going to the other one. And at that, Zach Schofield from Rising Tides are going to be speaking. So that little thread that we had going, you can learn more about that there. Okay, that's the end of this session. So I've got a couple of things to tell you about. First of all, at 7, we're going to have dinner. I think it's been a fantastic success so far. We've got a veggie curry and a meat curry and other little bits and pieces, so that'll be ready at 7. Tomorrow morning, we're going to start bang on 10. The centre's open from 9 o'clock. So if you want to come and get brekkie, Noreen and Michael have made brekkie, so please do that. And at 10 o'clock, we've got From Trump to Netanyahu, Modi to Milel, understanding the rise of the global far right. So that was the other thread of discussion that was going through today. So that'll be great. And who doesn't want to hear about what's happening in India with Modi? I think many of us do. Yeah. And I think that's all I've got to tell you because who's coming up to talk? There you are. Sam's going to come up and tell you what we're going to be doing at 8 o'clock.
Thanks, Sue. So just very quickly, most of you know, but I'm really just giving it a hard sell, okay? Not just an announcement. So we've got dinner at 7 o'clock, but then from about 10 to 8, we're going to be set up. There's not a lot of setup to do. We're going to be setting up for the gig with David and Kamala right here on this stage, okay? And that's going to be great fun, and if you haven't already bought a ticket, I'm asking you to do so. Now, I know you think, oh, these socialists, you know, they're going on about capitalism, and you've seen nothing till you've seen the socialist sort of wallet shakedown, which is true. It's true, but we have to for a reason. You know, we live under capitalism, quite seriously. And so, for instance, just bringing our international guests over has cost us $10,000, you know, in international flights. I mean, it's a real kick in the guts that Amar, you know, was dudded his visa. I mean, we might still eventually get his visa. So just as so they didn't actually refuse his visa. They've just said, "Oh, we're looking into it. We're looking into it." They've been looking into it for 4 months. They haven't actually been doing anything. It's their way of, you know, if they knocked it back, then they've got to justify it. So we don't want to waste that sort of effort. But you know, the $2,000 we spent on Amar's airfare, that's gone. You know, we lose that. And you know, we don't. You know, we're aware of, you know, carbon miles and all that sort of stuff. So we do zoom in some of our speakers, but you just ask yourself, you know. A comrade like Lynn, you know, or Salim, who we've heard today, and the inspiration that they've given us, I sort of think, you know, we can't be absolutely fundamentalist about this question about carbon travel miles. You got this, you know, when you go to buy the airfare and they say, oh, you know, you can buy carbon offsets, and you think, oh yeah, what are they really fucking doing, these offsets? I think, for me, I think it's like activist offsets, you know, quite seriously. If you know. There's a bit of investment in a few airfares for these comrades to give us some inspiration and a boost to keep punching on for the struggle. Okay, so think of it that way. Okay, so that's the most significant expense that we have for the conference. So we need things like the gig tonight to actually cover those costs. And obviously, if we go above that, then we've got other costs we have to cover as well. So for people who are familiar here with the Bulu Activist Centre, we've actually, by our standards, we've spent a lot of money to get this place shipshape, basically. So even just a modest renovation of this space to put in a disability accessible toilet and a kitchen and some of the other bits and pieces, the air conditioners, that's $170,000, you know. And so we've had supporters who've made some really fantastically generous donations, but we've also had to sort of beg, borrow and steal to get over the line. I'm quite serious, you know, just, you know. Some of us breathed in a lot of toxic chemicals and lots of things together as well. You know, but even just the expenses in the just in the last 2 weeks, there's just $7,000 we couldn't avoid, and but you know, Comrade Janet down there, it's basically gone on her credit card, you know, like, because otherwise the conference was, you know, It has, right? So otherwise the conference wasn't going to happen. And the Bulu Activist Centre, it's not just for now, and it's not just the Socialist Alliance that uses it. We're very serious about our commitment to trying to engage and work with other activists in other campaigns. So groups, if you're not aware, there's other groups that meet here: Disrupt Burrup Hub, Unions for Refugees, the Black Swan, Anarchist Reading Group, Australia-Cuba Friendship Society. Who have I forgotten? The list goes. Unionists for Palestine, Jews for Palestine. They've got a Sudanese and an Eritrean musical group that gig and jam here, that sort of stuff. We want this to be a pumping place for activists to come and meet and do stuff and share ideas, all that kind of thing. But it does, and you know, we only ask those groups to really just pay the bare cost for using the place, just to keep the lights on, that sort of stuff. So our fundraising is really important for Bulu people. Probably in about a month's time, when we've got our breath back, we're going to do another fundraiser, you know, to actually start to get that kind of return. So, but it starts with the gig tonight. So if you haven't already bought a ticket, someone's going to come around and check that you do buy a ticket. If you and to stick around. Whether you stick around, if you're really tired and want to go home, we're still going to ask you to buy a ticket. Okay. Sorry. $15, and there's a concession rate. But the rule, as always, is if you want to be here and you're low on coin, we're not going to turn you away. Understand that. So stick around, have fun.